pray for us for our event.
기도하겠습니다. Let's pray in Korean. 하나님 아버지 은혜를 감사를 드립니다. 오늘 미주아태재단 주최로 우리 청소년 마약 예방 프로그램을 진행할 수 있도록 인도하신 것을 감사를 드립니다. 하나님 이 자리에 미주아태재단과 그리고 애틀란타 총영사관과 애틀란타 한인회, 애틀란타 교육을 비롯하여 한인 여러 단체들이 함께 참석하여서 우리 미래 세대 청소년들의 마약 문제를 함께 논의할 수 있도록 인도하신 것을 감사를 드립니다. 하나님 이 미국이 또 미주와 전 세계와 하나님 또 한국도 이제는 마약에서부터 자유로운 나라가 되지 못하고 있습니다. 하나님 우리 아이들의 영혼과 육체가 마약으로 인해서 무너지는 것을 봅니다. 그렇지만 하나님 우리 한인 사회들은 아직도 우리가 마약의 문제로부터 멀어져 있다고 우리는 안전하다고 생각합니다. 그렇지만 그런 우리의 마음을 틈타서 하나님 조금씩 우리 마약이 우리 한인 사회를 들어오는데도 불구하고 우리가 아직 알지 못하고 무엇이 문제인지 깨닫지도 못하는 그런 상황이 있습니다. 하나님 우리 미주아태재단이 이렇게 주최하는 이 청소년 마약 예방 프로그램을 통하여서 우리가 다시 한번 마약에 대해서 경각심을 갖게 하여 주시옵소서. 그리고 한 사람의 노력이 아니라 우리 모두 합심해서 하나님 이 문제를 잘 대처할 수 있도록 인도하여 주시옵시기를 원합니다. 하나님 진행되는 행사 순서마다 하나님께서 함께하여 주실 줄 믿습니다. 또한 특별히 하나님 이 행사를 개최할 수 있도록 장소를 허락해 주신 예수소망교회 박대영 목사님과 성도님들에게 감사를 드립니다. 하나님 예수소망교회가 날마다 부흥하게 하시고 하나님 아버지 우리 미래 우리 청소년들을 위해서 헌신하는 교회가 되게 하여 주시옵소서. 감사를 드리며 예수님의 이름으로 기도합니다. 아멘.
Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to Children Youth Drug Prevention Program Seminar. I'm sorry to not many people attending here because weekend, so everybody busy. But even though this is a great opportunity to learn about drug prevention, I think I'm great privilege to be honored to have you here. Especially I'd like to thank you for Gwinnett County, which is Gwinnett County Commissioner Chairwoman Nicole Hendrickson is a great leader. We have great people here care about our community. So I'm so happy to be leading Gwinnett County. First of all, I know Gwinnett County Police Chief is here, supposed to be here, but I don't know whether he'll show up or not. Chris Penanelli, and also we have Gwinnett County District Attorney General Bessie Gasson. I'm very happy to hear. And also we have Assistant Attorney General for the Gwinnett County, Chris Lee. And we are here to get together between compact between the parents, also children. We don't know what to do with these drugs, but we have to know. Of course, without love, we cannot be able to handle for the children. And the love is taking care of everything. We can kill so many people with this gun violence and drug and alcohol everywhere. We just turn around, we cannot be able to say this is a safe place to live. But I don't know exactly how many people, but all over the United States, the best place to live in the United States, the city, which is county, is Gwinnett County. That's what I heard, and I'm very proud. It's wonderful. But especially here, multi-racials live in this country, this Gwinnett County. The most Americans watching on this Gwinnett County, politically, economically, and socially. So we are eager to take the step together, work together to protect all our children. And also, we get together, support all these communities to the best live and safety-wise. And I'm so very happy to have you here, and especially here, I'd like to say Atlanta Consul General, Consul Joe Myung here. I think it's great. All these care about the community, for the Korean citizen. And I like to say a few recognition for Korean people here in Gwinnett County. Rapidly grow over 150,000 population is in Gwinnett County. So a lot of people attention, and they keep moving toward to the many companies moving toward this here. And I think growing Georgia State plus, especially Gwinnett County. So we need to together work together, society, to get better safe. I think it's wonderful. So thank you so much for coming us.
지금 송 회장님 좋은 말씀 많이 해주셔서 간단히 인사만 하겠습니다. Thank you, Pesci, and thank you, your husband. Thank you. 그죠? 우리 박수 한번 해드릴까요? 우리 송기성 회장님 좋은 말씀 다 해서 저는 너무 좋은 이런 자리를 마련해서 감사합니다. 앞으로도 이런 모임을 위해서 예방협회라든가 검찰청과 검사들 같이 함께 범죄위원회 같이 함께 저희 한인회 협의체를 구성해서 노력하겠습니다. 너무너무 좋은 장소입니다. Thank you so much. 감사합니다.
Thanks for inviting me today. It's a really great honor to be here to talk with many people who are interested in this important matter. And I think that this is really important matter in Korea as well. The drug situation is critical in my country as well. And then there's been an uptick in drug problem. So our Korean government is responding against drug crime. Now, I think it's a shared responsibility for all of us to tackle this problem. So I really appreciate the people who made this event to work together. So the Korean government will support this kind of activity always. Thank you.
Community Affairs Division, he and I worked many events together, right? Yeah. So I've seen his presentation before, and he's really good at it. So without further ado, I want to give you a mic to you. Okay.
Thank you. So just like you said, our biggest thing is that the drug is a big problem, right? And that's something that we all have to take into account and make sure that we're all doing our part to make sure that we can help try to reduce this issue that we have. So I do want to say thank you for the church. Thank you for all the members that have allowed me to be able to be here today and provide this presentation for you all. I've been told that we're going to hold questions for the end. Thank you. Check. All right, good. You guys hear me? Awesome. So I've been told that we're going to hold questions for the end. So I'll try to get through my presentation. I will remain here after my presentation in case you have questions for me. Okay. But today we're going to talk about drug awareness for teens and adults. Okay. What I want to let you know is some of the things to look out for. Okay. There's going to be slides in here that talk about what are some of the feelings that somebody may have while they're under the influence of a drug. And those are very important. But what I want to provide for you is a way to know if someone that you love and care for is actually using drugs. So we're going to go over a lot of the different ways that some of these drugs may look, as well as some of the utensils that people may use to end up partaking in that drug, okay? So I'll begin. So just a little backstory here, like I said, it's really just the reason why we're going to be teaching this program. Right? So why do some people use drugs, right? A lot of times we have, people may just want to fit in, maybe they're dealing with a lot of stress, things of that nature, so they're trying to find a way to escape a lot of those pressures, okay? Sometimes with pressures, there's also peer pressure, right? Sometimes there's friends, co-workers, other folks that are influencing our loved ones to be able to start participating in some of this activity, right? So we can always do the best we can to educate our children on how some of these drugs are bad and how they negatively affect families. But sometimes it's the outside influences that are actually, getting our loved ones to participate in illegal drug activities, okay? Sometimes we want to feel grown, we want to maybe rebel, right? We all have, at some point in our life, rebelled. We don't want to follow the rules, things like that. And so sometimes these things can kind of fit hand in hand with that. These are just what can be a drug, right? We have medications, we have illicit, narcotics, things of that nature as well. They can be found in all forms, right? It could be, powders, it could be liquids, it could be, like hard pieces, we'll call like rock or something like that. And we refer to like crack, cocaine, things like that. So you have stimulants, things that kind of speed up the body. So we're going to be looking at like cocaine, your ecstasies, your methamphetamines, things like that are really going to boost the way that the body's feeling. A lot of times when people are under a stimulant, they kind of feel hot, right? So a lot of times we have issues where people are actually removing items of clothing to try to cool themselves off, because a lot of times these drugs are making people very hot, right? So, for example, if it's 45 degrees outside, very cold, and someone has now removed a lot of their clothing and they're saying that they're very hot, that may be a kind of a telltale sign that somebody might be under the influence of a drug there. You have your depressants, which kind of reverse. They slow things down. Sometimes people's moods and their emotions are very downplayed, maybe depressed, kind of slow to really see how a lot of these things are going into effect. Obviously, alcohol is one of those drugs. We talk to families all the time. A lot of times our kids are abusing alcohol, right? You got to be 21. A lot of times you have kids that are 15, 16, 17, and so forth that are utilizing alcoholic beverages, things of that nature, right? So we kind of have to do our part in our own homes to try to remove a lot of those items so that way our kids aren't ingesting it or taking it to school, going to parties, things like that. And what some people may do is they will actually mix alcohol with other illicit drugs, prescription medications, things like that. What it does is it has an adverse effect. It makes the effects of the drug and the alcohol makes it worse, and now they're actually having more intense signs and symptoms when they're going ahead and mixing the alcohol and drugs there. So a lot of times you're going to have that flushed skin, maybe redness in the eyes, watery eyes, things like that. Lack of coordination, someone's having trouble balancing, walking in a straight line, things of that nature, okay? Just more facts here. The biggest one that I would say most of the youth are really dealing with right now is marijuana. Marijuana is probably one of the bigger ones that a lot of the kids are utilizing. As you see up there, there's really two different types, okay? What you have is you have a sativa and you have an indica, okay? Those are just different strands, right? What that means is that those two different types of marijuana have been grown in a different climate. Temperature, elevation, all those other things affect the feeling that you get when you partake in marijuana of each of these kinds, okay? With a sativa, they call it a functioning high, right? Someone's under the influence of marijuana, they're able to be, active, you're not sleepy, anything like that, right? So sometimes they'll nickname a sativa the creative drug. Maybe it makes me feel more artistic, I'm able to be artful, play music, things of that nature, right? When you get into indica is that very sleepless, that's that very, you're kind of just out of it, you're almost asleep, things of that nature. So you're very slow, your responses are slow, you can still have that slurred speech, things of that nature as well. So two different feelings from the same type of drug, right? One kind of makes you more awake, kind of allows you to be active. The other really kind of puts you to sleep, right? That's where the nickname with indica is they say that you're in the couch, okay? A lot of times when people partake in an indica, they sit on the couch, they watch TV, they fall asleep, things of that nature, right? So if you have someone who's normally upbeat, actively moving all the time, and all of a sudden they're just on the couch the entire time, or they're sleeping all the time, things like that. A lot of times you're going to have, an increase in appetite, things like that. So if you have someone who's maybe not eating so much food on a normal basis, all of a sudden you start seeing, an increase in appetite. This could be another one of those signs there. So just continue. Some of the common terminology names, right? You have the old terms, you have the weed, bud. Sometimes you go into spice, and you go into like a
fake version of marijuana. A lot of times they'll call that a spice. Okay, Mary Jane is a very older term. You also have ganja, things like that. Some of the newer terms that you're going to hear now, one of the big ones is Zaza. That's huge up north, and we start finding that those terms are starting to come down here to Georgia. The reality is that names are temporary. You know, people have a name for it. All of a sudden, the authorities find out, parents find out about certain names. All of a sudden, they go ahead and start calling it something different. So Zaza is probably your more common term. At this moment, you have terms like blinkers, dabs, wax, and carts. And so we'll talk more about those in just a moment. So there's going to be a lot of pictures here, okay? So what I call these are the wraps and the bowls. So what a lot of people will do when they partake in marijuana is they will actually smoke it through inhalation, right? So what you'll see, if you can see this little packaging right here, it's made by a company called Raw, and those are just rolling papers. So what they'll do is they'll take the marijuana, they'll break it up, they'll put it in that paper, and then they'll roll their own cigar, right? Or their own cigarette, or their blunt, things of that nature, okay? So if you find a lot of these little wrappers, they're almost like a baking sheet. You know, it's a white piece of paper, it's very thin. So if you find that your child has things like that in their household, now we know that there's potential that they're using marijuana or some other type of illicit drugs, okay? Before, you could be 18 years old and partake in tobacco. Now you have to be 21, right? So if you have a youth that is under 21 and now you start seeing a lot of these other things, okay, well, why is my child, why is my loved one having tobacco-type products? Because that's what they get marketed under. They say, oh, that's for tobacco, but in reality, they use it for marijuana, things like that. So if you start seeing some of these, if your child's obviously not 21, then there's a chance that they're using it for marijuana. These bottom two right here, all those are just basically tobacco wraps. A lot of times they're just cheap gas station cigars that people will take. And what they do is, in this picture, just to the right of it, what they've done is they've taken one of those cigars, they've cut it down the middle, and then what they do, they cut it right down the middle, they remove all that tobacco that was originally in with that cheap gas station cigar, and they'll actually take the marijuana, put it in there, and then they'll roll a blunt, a joint, marijuana cigarette, whatever you like to call it, right? So a lot of times, if you live in an apartment, maybe at your home, if all of a sudden you find a bunch of pieces of really short, chewed up pieces like brown paper or tobacco, if you're able to tell that it's tobacco, a lot of times that lets you know, if I find this, somebody has taken a cheap gas station cigar, they've removed that tobacco, and now they put marijuana in there, right? Down here in the bottom right-hand corner, that's just a bowl. All that is just a piece of glass, which is essentially a pipe. What they'll do is they'll break up the marijuana, they'll put it in there, and that's just another way to smoke it as well. On the top right corner, you see this like little circular disc. It's almost like a hockey puck. That's just a grinder. So what they'll do is they'll actually take a big piece of marijuana like here, they'll put it into that little puck, they'll twist it, and then it turns into a bunch of really tiny pieces of marijuana, and that's how they're able to put it into a cigar, okay? So once again, some more things to kind of pay attention to when you're at home. Another way to smoke it is through bongs or dab rigs, okay? The old school bong was just a little tube. They put some water or some other type of beverage. They would end up putting the marijuana in a little bowl piece on top of it, like in this picture here, and then they would inhale that. And so that's just another way to smoke it. Well, the reality is, where it was just a tube with a little bowl at the bottom, now it's become very creative. There's a lot of different companies. They have these monthly subscription boxes that you can get. One is like High Times, or they have the monthly High Club, things that kids will actually go online. They'll go ahead and pay for that subscription. That company will actually mail you products to smoke marijuana. And so what they do is now over time, where it was just a little glass pipe with a little hole, now they're getting very creative, okay? So if you see something like this, it could be in the shape of a cartoon, shape of a car. I mean, you think of something, and they have a bong that's designed in that fashion, right? So sometimes our youth may purchase these items or have these items, and they go, oh, it's just a vase or it's just a fancy piece of glassware, right? And so they try to lie to us and say, oh, no, that's just a decorative piece that I've gotten from a friend or that I bought. In reality, it's being used to smoke marijuana there. In the middle is where we get the term dab. So essentially what that is just a pure form of THC, which comes out to a wax, is kind of the official term that they call them. But whenever you smoke them, they'll just call it a dab. And the reason why they call it dab is because they'll take just a small portion of that little wax there, which is essentially pretty close to 100% THC. THC is the active, the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana that gets that individual that high feeling, right? So what they've done now is they found a way to extract that pure form of THC, and instead of it being in a green leafy material, now it's in like a wax or a honey type consistency, okay? So what they'll do is they'll get a dab rig, basically just made up of a couple different pieces, which looks kind of like the bomb. But the main part is they'll have a torch like this. It's a butane torch. And what they'll do is they'll actually heat up the bowl on there, which would be right here. They'll heat that portion up to where it gets pretty hot, almost to where it gets like an orange color, but not quite that hot. And what they do is they heat that part up, they'll put that wax in that bowl, and it almost vaporizes immediately, and then they smoke it just like a bomb. So our kids have different forms, so marijuana isn't always that green leafy material. It could be liquids, it could be little crystals, things of that nature as well. So at the same time, you know, if you have a butane torch like what's here, are you really going to be lighting candles with that? No, right? It's like a miniature flamethrower, if that, right? So for the most part, you're not going to be using that to light a candle. So if you see something like that that is a torch, it comes just like everything. It's in different sizes, different shapes, colors, designs, whatever the case may be. But if you look and your child or your loved one has a torch, and they're, oh, I just use it for candles, I like the smell of candles, no one needs that much firepower to light a candle, right? So a lot of times that kind of lets you know that they may be actually using a dab rig to be able to smoke like a pure form of THC, that wax, that dab as well. The other thing, we'll get into blinkers, vape cartridges. Vaping is huge. You know, a lot of people were trying to quit smoking, things of that nature as well, so they would use different vapes. Well, the reality is that the marijuana market, they see that, hey, look, a lot of people like vapes and things of that nature, so now they provide liquid THC, and they're able to put it into a vape and be able to smoke it that way. So one of the other common terms is a blinker that we talked about earlier, okay? Blinkers or carts. What they'll do is it's just a cartridge, just for short. Instead of saying cartridge, they just call it a cart, like a shopping cart. And so what it is just another way of smoking marijuana. So a lot of times our youth are able to get like disposable vape cartridges, little things like that are probably smaller than my clicker, and these kids will just keep them in their pocket. They're very thin as well. So a lot of times you may find that and go, oh, maybe it's a USB drive or something like that, and you put it away. In reality, there's a possibility that it's basically just a disposable vape pen that somebody may be able to have as well. So a lot of different forms. As you see on the right side of the screen, those are just the different cartridges, right? So you're able just to take it out of the packaging. It has a tube, it's got the liquid in there, everything like that. All you do is just add that to a vape pen like this one here, and all of a sudden now you've got your own marijuana vape, right? So some of the terms for that one on the left is going to be a blinker. The one on the right is going to be a cart or a cartridge, because we're able just to replace it really quick and be able to have another THC product there. And then these are just some of the things, right? Some of the short-term effects are going to be loss of coordination, the sleepiness that we talked about when you're looking at like an indica versus a sativa. You're going to have the reddening of the eyes, increased appetite, things of that nature as well. Long-term effects, there could be some mental issues. There could be obviously, anytime you smoke anything, period, you're going to have lung, heart issues, things of that nature as well. So with that, we'll go into cocaine. Obviously, this has been something that's been around for a very long time, just like marijuana and the other drugs that we'll talk about today. But the main thing is that this is going to be, for the most part, about a white powdery substance, pretty much very white to the color. Sometimes the color may change depending on what's been done to the cocaine or crack. A lot of times what people will do is they'll they'll take the cocaine, let's say you have a pound, for example, they go in kilos, but we'll talk about pounds today, right? So, for example, somebody would maybe take a pound of cocaine, all of a sudden they say, well, I want to maximize my profits. They put a bunch of medications and other, headache pills, all sorts of other stuff in there to then, add more to that product, and now they have more. Where that comes into play is that when people are actually adding a lot of things to the drugs that people are taking now. We'll talk about the biggest thing right now that a lot of people hear about, which is fentanyl. We'll talk about that here toward the end of the slide as well. And so there's just a quick portion there. They call it coke, crack, snow, blow, nose candy, rocks, just like anything else. There's always going to be a bunch of different names. Those names are constantly changing, right? So it's always important that if you're reviewing some of the messaging, the emails, the Facebook, Instagram, whatever that your loved ones are using, and all of a sudden you start finding weird names and terms and things like that, that may be something to kind of pay more attention to, because they may be using it to refer to things you're not supposed to have, right? They know that you may be looking at their phones, their emails, things like that, so now they're trying to use code words and names to be able to talk about it without you really realizing that. As we talked about, just define powdery substance, a lot of times they're snorted through the nose. You can really be as creative as you like with a lot of these different drugs. So you're going to have an increased heart rate, you're going to have the muscle spasms, the paranoia, things of that nature. We talked about, people's bodies being, elevated all of a sudden. Now they're really hot, they're really sweaty when it's a really cold environment. Those are one of the drugs to kind of pay attention for that as well. And here are just some of the different usages. So what they'll do is they'll have these little tiny containers. They're able to put the cocaine in there for storage. So a lot of times you can find these. Some people may use them for like a urn or something. If they have a loved one, they try to put them on a keychain, things of that nature. When in reality what we find is that people are actually putting cocaine and different other drugs within these little containers. They may use a spoon, a fingernail, something like that to be able to snort the cocaine as well. Just like marijuana, we've got pipes here as well. They're able to go and smoke it. That's kind of when it gets into that crack form. It's still it's a small little rock. It's kind of still white, but sometimes it has a little yellowish tinge color to it. So that's something else to kind of pay attention for as well. Just different inhalants. Just like the name sounds, people are just smelling certain things, and that is changing the way that their brains are acting. It gives them that high sensation. A lot of times you're going to have the slur of speech, sometimes drooling, things of that nature as well. And the hard part about these substances is that most of these substances that people are using for inhalants are just things you can buy at the store. Spray paint, maybe different chemicals, acetone for your nails, things like that. They're able to smell those products consistently over time, and now they're getting that high feeling in their head. What we find is that a lot of times you'll have diminished capacities for the brain, things like that. It really changes the way that the brain functions. And so a long-term abuse of this is really going to affect the brain cells. And so these are just some of the things, poppers, whippets, laughing gas, rush, things like that. A lot of times you're going to hear like whippets or something like that are one of the big things. As we see here, what's big in the paintball or the airsoft industry, they have a lot of these little canisters that have CO2 that propel the firearms for airsoft. So a lot of times what they do is they'll take those little cartridges that have CO2 gas in them, so they're able to puncture them and then inhale that. And then over time, now they're getting high, and like I said, they're going to have effects to the brain as well. And it can be anything. It can be lighter fluid, it could be a chemical, anything like that as well. So with it, irregular heartbeat, you're going to have loss of smell sometimes because you're constantly smelling something. All of a sudden, you're going to start destroying a lot of those things. Your sense of smell, your nose, your brain, things of that nature as well. You can have nausea, nosebleeds, just like, if you keep breathing that stuff in over time, what happens is now you start burning holes into your nose. You have, bleeding, things of that nature as well. Folks that do a lot of like cocaine, things like that, they'll actually burn the lining of their nose, and sometimes they have to have surgeries to close that hole up again. So sometimes it's kind of some of those issues. With anything that you introduce into the body, if the body is unfamiliar, it's always going to try to fight that drug, that substance off. So So you're always going to have potential issues with the liver, the kidneys, lungs, things of that nature as well. Okay, and here's just some of the usages again. Most of us are going to look and say, why is there a can of whipped cream up there? Does Officer Montos like whipped cream? Of course I do. However, the problem is that just like that little cartridge that we talked about before, there's CO2 gas that's going to be in that whipped cream can. That CO2 is what pushes the whipped cream out of that can. Okay? So if you ever use whipped cream and you get to the very end and there's no more whipped cream, if you still push that nozzle, you can still hear the gas coming out, right? So a lot of times that same gas is what they're inhaling, and now they're getting high as well. The next thing is essentially the same thing, but that's more of a industrial whipped cream can. So a lot of times your Starbucks, your places that have espresso baristas, anything that where you would really be distributing whipped cream, things like that, what they'll do is they will actually, this little tube right up here, that's actually where they're going to put the CO2 canisters that we talked about before. They'll put that CO2 canister in there. Once they turn it, it releases all of that CO2 gas into the main tank. Where normally you would put a cream, you'd put milk, have whipped cream, something to that nature, you would have it in there, but in reality, they don't put anything in there. So all that's in there is gas. They just continue inhaling that over time. So just another usage. So if you have a loved one or a teen, and all of a sudden they have a bunch of whipped cream cans, or they have an industrial whipped cream can for a restaurant, a business, bakery, whatever the case may be, and you know that your child does not bake or partake in anything like that, now we have the potential that now our child is abusing inhalants and is using CO2 gas to make that end meet. This next one is just a simple rag, okay? It's just a cloth, but as we look on that cloth, there's a lot of paint on it, okay? A lot of times our paints have a lot of hazardous chemicals, things like that as well. Plus, they still have that CO2 gas that we talked about earlier, okay? You can look up online, somebody high off spray paint, something like that. There's been plenty of mug shots where people go to jail and there's spray paint all over their face because they spray it onto the rag, they hold that rag up to their nose, they inhale it over and over and over again until they essentially black out, right? So, same thing. All of a sudden you find paint on somebody's face or a bunch of spray paint cans and they're not an artistic person who uses spray paint, another thing to think about, right? Doesn't mean it's always true, but it just gives you at least something else to think about. And that last one is just keyboard duster, right? Sometimes we have our laptops, we have our computers at work, and all of a sudden we may utilize a duster to be able to take all that grimes and cookie crumbs and everything else that we do on a daily basis to clean up our keyboard. Folks will use that as well. So I've had cases where people, we end up finding them behind the wheel of a car and they have entire packages of keyboard cleaner, different aerosol can cleaners, things like that, where they're just inhaling those over time. So people will go to the store, Office Depot, Walmart, whatever store sells it, they'll go there and they'll buy entire cases of it. I don't know about you, but I've never bought more than one can ever. And then I end up losing it, right? So I'm just like, oh, whatever, right? But if you notice that a loved one is buying a bunch of these different cans and you never really see them using it, another thing to kind of think about. Just because somebody has one of these items or uses that item doesn't always mean that they're going to be using illicit drugs, but it just gives us an idea. So that way, later on, as you're talking with your kids, your loved ones, if you start seeing some of these items, you may go, okay, maybe now I need to pay a little bit more attention. Crystal meth, methamphetamines, it's basically just going to be like little shards of like, almost looks like glass or almost like rock candy, something like that. You know, if you take sugar, you make it hard and you break it into pieces. It can almost be like that. They're generally going to have like a white frosted kind of crystal, but depending on the way that it's transported, it may have a different color to it. For example, what they've done in the past is they'll take diesel trucks, they'll put a bunch of the crystal meth inside of the diesel tank. Over time, those crystals start absorbing that diesel color. They have to then put the methamphetamine into like a acetone or something to try to remove a lot of that, but it's still going to have that like a tinge, that different color to it, right? The reality is that drugs are made with literally anything and everything, right? So the fact that people are ingesting these and inhaling them is very scary. When you look at like methamphetamine, cocaine, or like crack, a lot of times those things are just made with different household cleaners that you have underneath your sink, right? Your average teenager is probably not going to be making this kind of stuff, but letting them know what this stuff is comprised of is pretty scary, and hopefully it kind of keeps them away from that, right? I tell folks, we have the cartoon Curious George. Curious George gets himself in trouble all the time because he's so curious, right? If we can remove some of that curiosity and talk with our kids, educate our kids, we're that better off, and hopefully they don't ever abuse those different types of drugs, right? So I would rather my child hear from my mouth what drugs and all these other things do to you versus letting my child's friend or somebody else negatively influence them and tell them, oh no, it's okay, right? So we can do the best we can for our own kids, and hopefully that's good enough to be able to help them resist temptations from friends and other colleagues, things like that. And so as you see here, at the bottom, it's that frosted white color that I was telling you about, and then on the top one you have that other color there, right? So if you have something like that and you find your kid's room and they say, oh no, that's just sugar, or that's Pop Rocks, or something else, right? It's potential that it actually could be methamphetamine, things of that nature. So the names here, you've got speed, ice, glass, meth, crystal, crank, a lot of different names, but as we talked about today, all those names are continually changing, right? So as we're reviewing our kids' materials, our family's materials, looking for some of those key terms that almost, if you're listening to a normal conversation, all of a sudden this random word comes out that makes no sense, there's potential that it could be something to pay attention to, right? Just some of the different things: disturbed sleep, hyperactivity, nausea. A lot of folks that are under these types of drugs, they're going to have delusions that I'm God, I'm Jesus, I have these magical powers, I'm super strong, things like that. And so a lot of these situations can be very, very scary at times, right? So we always got to do the best we can to try to recognize somebody under these drugs, and most of the drugs that we've talked about today, there's always a huge risk for paranoia. They always think somebody's out to get them, things of that nature. So if all of a sudden your loved one's saying, oh, people are in the woods trying to get me, people are doing this, people are doing that, and it seems a little strange, there's potential that it could be, right? Different heroin, it's almost like cocaine. It's a powdery substance. It's generally going to be like a dark to light brown color. We'll see in just a second where they call it like brown sugar. So brown sugar, junk, skag, H, smack, horse, different names, right? But as you can see, most of heroin is really going to be injected through a hypodermic needle. What you'll see is that they'll actually put it on top of a spoon, they'll heat it up, they'll add a couple other things there to make it more of a liquid form. They'll actually use the hypodermic syringe to then soak up that liquid, and then they ingest it into the body through a vein, right? So a lot of times you'll hear things about the main vein and all these other stuff like that. And so one of your biggest things to look for is what they call track marks. Basically, if you see somebody, if you've ever donated blood before, they withdraw blood from you, you usually have that little tiny dot that's there. Well, if all of a sudden you see this person's got 5, 6, 10, 20 of them, okay, they're probably not donating blood that many times, right? So that's something else to think about. At the same time, that's one way to find out that somebody may be using heroin or some of these other drugs that are injected. But at the same time, they realize that people may be looking for those marks on their bodies, right? So sometimes they'll use them in places where maybe you don't really think about. The feet, the abdominal areas, things that you're not going to see normally, right? If I take my shirt off, if I take my pants on and I have my underwear on, all those other places you may not ever see, right? Unless I remove clothing. So sometimes people may use, they may inject under the nails. It could be a fingernail, it could be toes. They may do it on their feet, on top of their feet. So if all of a sudden you have a child and they're always walking around barefoot, they don't have socks on or anything like that, and now all of a sudden they're always wearing socks, always wearing shoes, or they're always covering up their hands, that may be a potential sign that they could be abusing heroin or one of the other drugs that can be injected by needle as well. So unless your child is diabetic and they take insulin, most people aren't going to have needles like that, unless it's like an actual medical condition. So if you've never, your child doesn't have any of those illnesses or things to watch out for, which requires a needle, and all of a sudden you find a lot of needles around, kind of another thing to kind of pay attention for. And so prescription drugs are really huge. That's one of the biggest things right now. It's probably one of the more abused ones now. It's just because they're very available, okay? You go to the dentist, you get an operation, they give you Oxycontin, Codone, all these other different types of drugs. And so a lot of these can just be sitting around the home, right? If you just had a surgery and all of a sudden you get all these pills, sometimes people just take a couple and then they leave the bottle there, right? So if you have a lot of these drugs sitting around and you're no longer using them, the best thing you can do is to remove them from the household, okay? A lot of your local pharmacies will take these medications. Obviously, we don't want to throw them in the trash. We don't want to put them down the sewers or anything like that, down the drain, because that just pollutes our water and it pollutes our county, right? So you can go to the local pharmacy. The police department has what we call a DEA drug take-back that we do probably 3 to 4 times a year, where we have officers at every one of our precincts, our headquarters location, and what you can do is you can come and you can drop off any type of drugs that you find, and we'll take it, no questions asked. We'll collect all those drugs, and then we'll turn them over to the DA, and they'll dispose of them correctly, okay? That does not have to be prescription drugs, okay? If you find methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, marijuana, any of those types of drugs, okay, and we're hosting one of those events, stop by, you can drop it off, we won't ask any questions, we won't talk to you if you don't want to, nothing. You show up, you drop off the drugs into a box that we have outside of the precinct that we're watching over, you drop them in there, and you can leave. No questions asked, we'll take any type of drug, and then from there they'll be turned over to the DEA, and from there they'll be disposed of correctly. That way they don't get into the wrong hands, or we don't end up polluting our county, okay? So you have painkillers we talked about. Oops, sorry. So our different painkillers, we have Oxycontin, fentanyl, morphine, depressants, Xanax are probably the biggest ones, Valiums, Adderall, Prozac, a lot of different types of medications that we have, right? As we talked about earlier, we talked about the word fentanyl, okay? Fentanyl is an actual drug that some people may be prescribed. A lot of times it's through a patch. So sometimes they'll have a little patch that people will put on their arms, and that absorbs into the body, but it's controlled, right? And so a lot of times what will happen is if somebody has a patch on, if you touch it and you don't require that medication, you can actually have pretty adverse effects to that, right? So in being a first responder, paramedics, things like that, they always have gloves on, so that way if they're handling the patient and this patient happens to have one of those fentanyl patches, they don't end up getting knocked out themselves. It's a very select group of people that actually are prescribed fentanyl. And like I said, for the most part, they're put in a patch, almost like a Band-Aid that you just put onto the skin, and that slowly absorbs into the body. But we'll talk about the abuse of the fentanyl in just a moment. So just some of the other prescription drugs: slow breathing, weight gain, heart problems, suicidal thoughts, hallucinations. Addiction is probably the biggest thing, right? Somebody has an injury, maybe they broke their ankle, they broke their arm, they get prescribed a medication, all of a sudden they like the way that it feels, and now they just continue to want it, right? And so if you have a lot of these drugs around your home that aren't being used, it may be easy for our loved ones to go ahead and start taking those medications. All of a sudden you realize you have this medication, you go back and you realize that a lot of it is now gone, right? So it's one of those things that, our doctors prescribe us medications and things for a reason. If at some point we don't take them, it's always best to just get rid of them. Because at the same time, medications can change over time. So if you have pills at your home, they may be, the integrity of that medication may be there for some time, but if it's months, a year plus, sometimes the medication can change, and now the effects can be adverse and be different than what it was supposed to be intended for. Like I said, painkillers, the list goes on and on with different types of prescription drugs. What we want to talk about today are Percocets. Percocets are probably the biggest pill that is being counterfeited today. Okay, there's a lot of issues with Percocets. Some of the names that they call Percocets are Blues, Perks, M's, 10s, 30s. The reason why they call it a blue is because the pill is actually a blue pill, right? They call it an M because on one side of the pill, it actually has the letter M stamped onto it. For the most part, when people give drugs nicknames, they're not very creative. It's a lot of the just easy stuff. However, there can be some creative things as well, which is always good to kind of pay attention for. Like I said, you'll see a little M that's on there. In this picture, on the other side of the pill, it's got the number 30 on there as well, right? So that's kind of where we get the M's, the 10s, the 30s. The numbers are just the doses of the pills, okay? But like I said, this is one that we find that are being abused a lot, okay? And the reason for that is that they're being made, they're fake pills, okay? They will put these indentions, these imprints, to make them appear as if they're an actual doctor-prescribed medication, but in reality, it's just a mixture of who knows what, okay? And what we find is that oftentimes there's fentanyl that is placed in this, which is different than the patch. Carfentanil, there's other types of fentanyls, but what they'll do, like we talked about, a lot of these drug dealers, they'll put other chemicals to make their product bigger so they can make more money. But one of those things that they do is they put fentanyl in there, okay? For heroin, a lot of these other drugs, people, they get the sensation of being high the very first time. They love it, right? And they're always chasing that high over and over and over again. So just like alcohol, we have some folks that abuse alcohol, where maybe they could have 3 or 4 drinks and they're drunk. Now it takes them 20 drinks to get drunk, right? Their body has developed that tolerance over time. So heroin and some of these other drugs have the same effect. After a while, it takes more and more and more for this person to feel the sensation of being high. So what happens is the users of the drug, they hear, oh, somebody might have overdosed on a drug. They think that drug is now more potent, that it now has a stronger effect, and say, well, I'm going to buy that product. So-and-so uses those drugs all the time, and if they overdosed, they had such a tolerance to it that it must be something very strong, right? Well, the reality is that fentanyl and other things have actually been put in there that will kill them. So it's not that they're getting extra high or anything like that. The fact is that there's drugs and other things being put into those medications that are actually killing us and not making those individuals high. It's killing them, right? The smallest amount of fentanyl can knock somebody out and kill them. You know, all the officers, we all have Narcan. Our paramedics, our fire staff, they all have Narcan. We also carry around AEDs to be able to help an irregular heartbeat. All those things also contain extra doses of Narcan. So sometimes we're able to administer Narcan and get somebody out of the negative effects of fentanyl and be able to bring that person back. But what we're finding is that where it only took 1 dose of Narcan, now it's 2, 3, 4 doses of Narcan, right? Because the level of fentanyl being put into a lot of these drugs are increasingly high, right? One easy way to tell if a Percocet is fake is that the fakes are very brittle, okay? Most of the pills that you take that are prescribed from a doctor or that you get over the counter, there's an agent that's in that pill to keep it in a hard form, okay? Well, when folks are making fake pills, they don't have different agents like that. So now these pills are very brittle and they're easy to break, right? So where you may take a pill and it may take, they sell things at the stores to cut them in half or whatever, and it's very hard to break those down. Now, just tapping it on the table could break that pill. So something like that could help us to know if this pill is actually an actual pill or is it a fake pill, right? Just because now it's super brittle, there's nothing that keeps that medication together. It just falls apart. And then one last thing to talk about it is fentanyl, right? It's a pharmaceutical grade fentanyl. It's kind of a synthetic opioid that they'll use for different things. We talked about a lot of those different special cases that some people may be prescribed fentanyl, but fentanyl is not for anybody, right? And so it says that it's 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine, right? So just the smallest amount of fentanyl can really have strong adverse effects, and it's killing people, okay? It's often mixed with heroin, cocaine, prescription medications. It's just a combination of different products that we find, right? People are just putting all sorts of stuff together, and now our youth, our family are ingesting these things, and it's killing them. Like we discussed, it's prescribed in a patch for the most part, but there are some pills. When we see it generally in an illegal form, it's going to be a powder substance that's brought over. And then these are just some of the other pictures that we talked about. You've got some of the fake Percocet pills there on the left. Okay, and then it comes in different forms. It's been put in heroin. It's in its own form. And as we look, the tip of a pencil, just a little bit on the tip of a pencil can kill somebody. There's videos online where officers are out. They're actually testing different drugs to try to get an identification so we can make the appropriate charge when we arrest somebody for possession of an illicit drug. And the reality is that just a small bit of fentanyl can be blown by the wind. And if you somehow are able to inhale just a small microscopic piece of it, it's able to kill you and put you out. So there's a lot of videos of people who are accidentally exposed to fentanyl, and it has very adverse, very scary effects. Just different drug dealers' information here, ways to find out if our family member, our loved one is a drug dealer, or things to notice, right? Sometimes we may find certain items that now let us know, hey, look, is our individual, our loved one, are they abusing drugs or are they selling drugs? Like I said, they're your kid's friend. A lot of times, you know, they may be in schools, they may be at businesses. Your drug dealers, they kind of go to wherever their clients are, right? So we have to realize who our loved ones are hanging out with, all right? Are we making sure that they're, you know, good individuals that have a positive influence on our children, on our loved ones? Or do we see that all of a sudden they start hanging out with one person, now their mood, their activity is now, they're rebellious, they're causing issues, where they were a good straight A student, all of a sudden they barely show up to class, they have, poor study ethic, things of that nature as well. Like I said, drug dealers, all they care about is money. Our loved ones, unfortunately, are just a number to these drug dealers, right? So we have to continue doing our part in making sure that our family, our loved ones are feeling cared for and that they have somebody to come to. Because when they find drugs, it's tough. Because that drug dealer does not care. All they care about is the money. And the unfortunate part is a lot of the drug dealers are armed, right? So now our loved ones are hanging out with people who are providing illegal illicit drugs, and they're also, armed, they have weapons, things like that. So there's multiple levels that our loved ones are being kind of put up against that are very dangerous in nature, okay? And these are just kind of the very basic, some of the items to kind of look for. These are just very small baggies, almost like a Ziploc bag that you would have in your kitchen, but it's almost like the size of your thumb, just very small. And they're able to put product in those little baggies, and then from there they can distribute them accordingly, right? So I would tell you there's probably really no reason why anybody would have baggies that small. You're not making a really small sandwich, you're not putting like a little bit of M&Ms in there, right? So once you start seeing baggies that are that small, and there's a bunch of them, I would almost say it's pretty much a for sure thing that there's illegal drugs present, right? In the middle you have a scale, okay? A lot of times people will have very small scales, about the size of your phone, okay? Somebody has a scale the size of your phone, there's probably not much good being done with it, right? You're not weighing jewelry or anything like that with a small handheld scale, okay? So there's just something else to kind of think about. You have the denominations of money there being rolled up by a rubber band. Your loved ones putting them in their sock or something. Just other things to kind of think about, right? If your kid is 15, 16, 17, 18 years old, are they going to have thousands of dollars worth of cash? Probably not. I'm 29 and I don't have that much money. Okay, I have a job. So the hard part is that if we start seeing our kids have lots and lots of money but they don't have a job, it's kind of something to think about, right? If you're not giving them money, then who is? Right? Because I imagine every one of you are wanting your kids to work and earn money for themselves, right? I got a smile up here. He knows what I'm talking about, right? So the reality is that if all of a sudden our children, our loved ones have no money, and all of a sudden they have thousands of dollars, that money's coming from somewhere, right? So one of the other things to kind of pay attention for. And that's about all my time. It was about 40 to 50 minutes, so I apologize for going a little bit over.